is to look directly at the nucleic acid, which is the infectious part of the virus.
All right, so we can refer to one method as an indirect method and one method as a direct method?
Correct.
As far as the indirect method, what error rate did that method have as used in your laboratory?
Well, any of these are basically tests that are clinical diagnostic kits, and before those are released for that purpose in any laboratory, the FDA goes through validation studies that define what is known as the specificity and sensitivity of a test kit. And the specificity means how specific is it to what you're looking for. That is, do you only detect AIDS, or maybe in certain clinical situations might you get a false indication that it isn't, it's positive but it really isn't AIDS. And as far as sensitivity, it says how many people who are infected are truly identified as being infected. So in any one of the aspects of any test, any laboratory test, is that none of them are perfect. And what you need to do is identify the parameters and the guidelines that allow you to weight, to determine how much weight to put on that test. So we use that kit, and the error rate that is reported for that kit, I think the original kit was probably 98% specific and 98 or 99% sensitive.
Isn't it correct that the earlier method, the indirect method, had an error rate of between 10 and 15%?
I don't believe it was that high.
Haven't you previously,
for HIV.
Haven't you previously testified that the error rate for the earlier technique was between 10 and 15%?
I believe I was talking about, I may have been talking about HCV there, not HIV.
I'm sorry, HCV?
The early kits on that had a higher false positive rate, and it has to do with the fact that you're looking for a virus that's found very infrequently in the population, so it's called low incidence, and that creates a problem in terms of this false positive situation.
Is an error rate of 10 to 15% in your view acceptable?
No.
Let's move to the newer form of HIV testing. That is the direct method. Is that
Yes.
the term that we can use?
Yes.
Does it have an error rate also?
There is no FDA-approved test for that, so there's nothing published in terms of what that rate is. I'm sure it will have an error rate.
Haven't you determined in your own lab that with regard to this second form of HIV testing that you encountered an error rate of between 2 and 5%?
For PCR testing?
Correct.
No, we haven't measured an error rate.
Have you in fact encountered an error rate of between 2 and 5% for any of your testing in your laboratory that you use, that is techniques used in casework?
I think you can find blind trials, for instance, of PCR testing where error rates for detecting viruses are that high, or perhaps.
And are these techniques that are still used in casework?
They are used, and what you need to know is what that error rate is. The important thing is knowing the error rate so that you can look at whatever the data is and properly evaluate how much weight to put onto it based on what your probability of making a mistake is.
In other words, with an error rate of, let's say, 1 to 2%, that's a portion of what a doctor may use in counseling a patient about whether that patient has a disease or not.
They take that into consideration, or should take that into consideration. If a test result doesn't seem to fit with their clinical impression, they would retest.
All right. Dr. Gerdes, I'm going to ask to shift your attention to the DQ alpha marker. I think we spoke a little bit about it earlier. It's your opinion, isn't it, that there is absolutely nothing scientifically suspect about the DQ alpha gene?
Nothing about the gene, no.
How many laboratories are testing for DQ alpha in forensics, to your knowledge?
I'm sure there are on the order of 100 or more.
You've actually personally, that is your laboratory, looked at the DQ alpha marker. I believe you described that yesterday.
With the direct dot blot, yes. Not with this kit.
By the other dot blotting method?
Yes.
Your laboratory does more work with this other marker closely related called DQ beta, correct?
Correct.
And is that because it has more different forms than DQ alpha does?
It's more polymorphic and that it's more relevant to the reason we look for it, which is for matching in transplants.
In other words, for your purposes, DQ beta is more informative in your laboratory than DQ alpha because it gives you more information about what you're in particular looking for.
Correct.
Your experience as far as DQ alpha is concerned comes primarily from cases that you've looked at in your role as a defense consultant, correct?
In terms of this kit, yes.
You've never used the kit, correct?
That's correct.
And I'm referring to the kit manufactured by Roche or developed by Roche, marketed by PerkinElmer, used by all three laboratories in this case, correct?
Correct.
Cellmark, Department of Justice, and the LAPD.
Correct.
To your knowledge, is this kit being used around the world in forensic analysis?
I believe it's being used in other countries.
Now, you expressed the fact that you're familiar with the user guide, is that right?
Yes.
And is that, I think we've brought this up before, does it look something like what I have entitled Amplotype User Guide?
That looks like the cover, yes.
And is that something that one can obtain from PerkinElmer
Yes,
to act as a guide in conducting this test?
that's correct.
In your opinion, that is a good guide, isn't that your opinion?
I believe in general, there are certain specific areas of it that I disagree with, but in general, it's a good guide.
Are there any publications, to your knowledge, scientific publications showing that the use of the Roche kit, DQ alpha kit, is unreliable?
There are no publications that will specifically conclude that it's totally unreliable. There are numbers of publications that discuss the contamination issues and other issues we've brought up.
Do you use kits in your laboratory typing? Any kits?
We use clinical kits, yes.
Is the use of kits in a clinical laboratory common?
It is.
Do you, in fact, use a kit in your own laboratory developed and manufactured by Roche?
The chlamydia kit, yes.
There are in this user guide, actually let's talk about two things. First, the user guide itself. It contains protocols on how to conduct PCR DQ alpha typing, correct?
Yes, it's sort of the cookbook, if you will.
There's also a second item that comes with the kit, correct? And it's a different document from this user guide.
The package insert?
What's the package insert?
Oh, that's it comes with the kit, and it's pretty much an abbreviated version of this larger user guide. It also describes more succinctly how you would set up the test.
In other words, it's also a cookbook, but it's kind of directly relevant to how to do each step.
Yes.
It's your opinion, is it not, that the user guide and the package insert describe correct scientific procedures for this test?
The procedures for setting it up are certainly, I agree with those.
All right, would this be an appropriate time, Your Honor?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the lunch hour. Dr. Gerdes, you can step down.
Please keep the noise down.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, please remember all of my admonitions to you. Don't discuss this case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you. Don't allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. We'll stand in recess for an hour and a half until 1:30, and at that time we'll take up the Stockdale issue, the motion. All right? All right, have a nice lunch. We'll see you back at 1:30. All right, back on the record in the Simpson matter. All parties are again present. Jury is not present. All right, this is a... Let's have it quiet in the courtroom, please. This is a motion to compel the defense to produce an audio cassette from from one Gretchen Stockdale for inspection and copying. All right, I'll hear from the people.
I think that I'd like to save the court some time. The court has read our moving papers. If I may, I'd like to waive my first argument to the court and respond to Mr. Uelmen's argument, if that's acceptable.
All right.
Well, Your Honor, what we have here is a tempest in a teapot, I think, but there is an important principle at stake, and the principle involves the continuous efforts of the prosecution to push this concept of reciprocal discovery beyond the constitutional limits and turn the defense into agents or investigators for the prosecution. What we have here is, in the normal course of investigation of the defense case, an interview of a witness by the name of Gretchen Stockdale, who informed us last September that on the evening of June 12th, she received a telephone message on her message machine from the defendant, from Mr. Simpson, at 7:35 p.m. The message has been reproduced in a word-for-word transcript in the New York Daily News. The message was simply a call from Mr. Simpson indicating, "Hey, Gretchen, sweetheart, it's Orenthal James, who is finally at a place in his life where he is like totally unattached with everybody," and then a laugh. "In any event, I've got a Sunday evening. I guess I'm catching a red eye at midnight or something to Chicago, but I'll be back Monday night. If you leave me a message, leave it on," and then leaving a telephone number to call back. So, of course, we knew of this prior to trial. We asked Ms. Stockdale for a copy of the message, and she gave us a cassette tape on which she had copied the message, but she retained the original telephone mini cassette, and we were led to believe that what we had was simply a copy of what she still had on her recording message machine. The contemplation of the defense was actually at one point to call Ms. Stockdale as a defense witness, because we regard this, of course, as exculpatory evidence that at 7:30 on the night of the homicide, Mr. Simpson is calling a lady friend to see if she's available to get together. That certainly murder or mayhem was not on his mind when he made that telephone call. We decided not to use this in our case in chief, so of course there was no obligation to turn any of this material over. The reciprocal discovery law simply requires us to turn over the evidence we intend to present at trial and the statements of the witnesses we intend to call at trial. And we did not intend and do not intend to call Gretchen Stockdale as a witness. Now, the prosecution learned of the existence of Ms. Stockdale and learned of the existence of this telephone message before they rested their case. And they apparently decided not to use it either. So the request at this point in the trial for the production of this tape is somewhat of a mystery. Number one, it certainly doesn't come under the reciprocal discovery law. This is not evidence that we are required to produce under the reciprocal discovery law, and I think they concede that in their moving papers. The only authority they rely on to require the production of this tape is Sanchez and Meredith, which deal with the defense's obligation not to conceal inculpatory evidence from the prosecution. Sanchez involved literally a written confession by the defendant and a murder checklist, highly incriminating and inculpatory evidence that the defense took possession of and conceitedly knew when they were taking possession of it that they then had the only copies available, and their retention of that evidence would have deprived the prosecution of any access to that evidence. Here, of course, we have evidence that is available. They know of Ms. Stockdale's existence. They have available an accurate transcription of the tape. It's too late to call her. It certainly does not appear relevant as any sort of rebuttal at this point, so it's not even at this point any longer admissible evidence. But even if it were, it is readily available to the prosecution. So on that basis, we would contend we have no obligation to preserve or to produce this evidence for the prosecution. If we did, then Your Honor would have to say that everything that the defense has in its possession that we're not going to put on in our case that we think might be of some conceivable use to the prosecution, we should now turn over so we can help strengthen their case. And that's not the point of reciprocal discovery.
Thank you, Mr. Uelmen. Ms. Clarke. I'm most concerned about the fact that Ms. Stockdale has apparently been known to both sides for a considerable period of time, certainly prior to the prosecution resting, and that what the defense has in its possession is a copy, not the original.
That's not the information we have, Your Honor. We did, in fact, speak to Ms. Stockdale in June. I don't know what exactly was known to the prosecution about her involvement with the defendant or the tape. I myself only learned of the tape very recently, its existence.
Well,
Nevertheless,
the problem is that the transcript of the tape was published in the New York Daily News in mid-May of 1995.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, Your Honor, but the transcript, a cold transcript, cannot tell the prosecution what's the tone of voice, how it sounds, where the call is made from, which might be very telling.
Well, the issue is when were you aware of it, and is this the original?
Yes, Your Honor. No, it's first of all, the information we have from Ms. Stockdale is that they have the original. She turned it over to Mr. Pavlik and has no copy with her anymore. So there's no way for the people to get it except through the defense because they have the only one. And that is what she told our investigator. We have that report attached to our moving papers. So there is no other way for us to get it. Now, furthermore, whether we knew of it or not, the defense had the obligation to turn this over. And let me explain why, Your Honor. I'm very troubled by defense counsel's characterization of his duties regarding discovery. The discovery obligations that the defense has with respect to this issue are framed most appropriately under People v. Meredith, not Sanchez, and not Prop 115. The defense is not required to act as our agents. That's clear, and no one argues to the contrary. But when physical evidence comes into the possession of the defense and thereby alters it either by reason of its location, its discoverability, or its condition, they are required to put the people in the same position as if they had not altered it by any of those means. By taking into his possession the tape that Ms. Stockdale had, Mr. Pavlik altered the condition by means of its location and made it undiscoverable by the people. By no means of investigation could we ever have obtained that other than the means we are attempting to use through this court, which is a discovery motion. It is in their possession. Were there some other means of getting a hold of it, we would have done so. But we have been prevented from doing so. And under People v. Meredith, the defense is now required to put us back into that same position, by the very least, giving it back to Ms. Stockdale. I submit that Mr. Pavlik should come into court and divulge the whereabouts of that tape. But certainly, we are not to be put in a position of having the tape be rendered undiscoverable by the fact that the defense has kept it and secreted it. Now, counsel has an interesting take on what the obligations of defense counsel are in saying, it's exculpatory, therefore I don't have to turn it over. If we accept that proposition, Your Honor, then all the defense has to do to avoid their obligation is say, well, but it's exculpatory. We don't have to turn it over. Well, that's true. The murderer wrote a letter admitting that he killed her, but, we don't have to turn it over because we think it's exculpatory. It shows evidence of mental insanity or a mental defense, and therefore it's exculpatory. I mean, you can see how you can take that sort of thing to its logical extreme, at which point they'd have no obligation under Meredith at all.
But fundamentally, the bottom line here that I have to know before I can rule on this, is this the original or is it a copy? The report from Dana Thompson indicates in a hearsay declaration, in fact, it's a report, it's not even a declaration, that Ms. Stockdale indicated to him on June the 12th that the, excuse me,
21st, wasn't
June 21st, that the copy that was given to Mr. Pavlik was the only copy of that tape, or the only tape recording in her possession of that
Right.
phone call. What I've heard from Mr. Uelmen is that, no, this is a copy of a microcassette,
we had
which some phone machines are and some machines aren't. So
Right.
I have two hearsay statements that are in conflict with each other factually. If
Assume
what
for-
Mr. Uelmen says that all they have is a copy that was given to them and you have equal access to the same source, then his side wins. If you're correct that this is the only tape recording of that conversation, then you're right, it is real evidence, and under Meredith, you're entitled to it. I agree. But I have a factual dispute here that I can't resolve.
But, Your Honor, why would we bring a motion before the court if we had equal access to it? Why bother? We don't need this. We don't need to file more paper. We've killed enough trees in this case. The court has heard from us enough through oral argument that we don't need to wear out our welcome further. There would be no reason to bring this motion if we had equal access. We want to hear the tape. And the truth of the matter is we can't, because we can't get it, and because the defense has it.
No, but the point I'm making is that I have a factual dispute, that all I have before me are a hearsay statement from you and a representation from counsel that is contradictory. That's what I got.
Then we're going to have a hearing?
Looks that way.
Darn. Okay. We
But
should
Ms.
call in.
Stockdale is available.
Yes. Yes. Okay. When would you like it, Your Honor?
I
Mr.
would only add, Your Honor, that you have two other things. You know that the availability of this information from Ms. Stockdale was equally available to the prosecution. They have the record showing the telephone call made on June 12th. They could have gone to Ms. Stockdale just as we did. And we also know that the Daily News was apparently able to obtain a tape and report a verbatim transcript of this telephone call. So there must be another copy out there somewhere.
Must be.
Must be, but if we can't get our hands on it, then what good does that do?
Well,
We got to find out.
have you served Ms. Stockdale with an SDT
I believe
or a
that
subpoena?
we had, this was an issue that we conferred on, and I believe that we have. I believe that we have, Your Honor. We conferred about what would be the best method to try and elicit this from her, and I believe we filed an SDT, and then we brought the motion before the court because that was not successful. I think what we do is,
This hearing will take all of 10 minutes.
I'm informed, Your Honor, that she told us when we served the SDT on her that she did not have it. So this hearing would take less than 10 minutes.
10 minutes, all right.
All right. So when would you like to
Mr.
do it?
Uelmen, when are you going to be available?
I'll be back next Tuesday, Your Honor.
Tuesday it
We've
is.
already calendared some hearings for Tuesday afternoon.
What time would you like, Your Honor?
Well, either before or after on Tuesday.
Sounds great.
Like I say, this is a factual determination.
Right,
Where's the original tape?
right,
Right?
right. It should be very simple. I'll get Ms. Stockdale.
All right, since we all agree it's a simple factual issue, let's move on to the jury.
Thank you.
All right. Deputy McNair? All right, let the record reflect we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Gerdes, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, the record should reflect Dr. John Gerdes is on the witness stand undergoing cross-examination by Mr. Clarke. Good afternoon again, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
You're reminded, sir, you are still under oath, and Mr. Clarke, you may continue with your cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Gerdes, just going back for a moment if I can, you described this morning how, as far as your paternity testing in your lab, that you used databases to calculate some numbers to describe how rare a match is between an alleged father, let's say, and a child, correct?
You're using a different type of statistics, that's correct.
As far as that method is concerned, do you use databases to make that calculation?
Yes.
Where are the databases from that you use in your laboratory for that purpose?
The database we use is obtained from Life Codes.
Is Life Codes a forensic laboratory?
They do forensic testing, yes.
Do you use any other databases other than those from Life Codes?
We have our own database as well, but we generally use the Life Codes-based database.
Now, I'd like to shift your attention, if I could, to polymarker that we discussed a little bit earlier this morning. Polymarker consists of more than one genetic marker, is that right?
That's correct.
And how many does it consist
5.
of? As far as this polymarker is concerned, is it also a test that's used using a kit?
Yes, it is.
And does Roche, in fact, manufacture, or through Perkin-Elmer market, the particular kit that's used to type the polymarkers?
They do.
As far as your own personal experience, have you used that particular polymarker kit?
We haven't used it for any casework, but I have had an occasion to run one kit's worth, which is 100 samples.
So you've used one kit and you've run 100 samples through the polymarkers.
Yeah, I'm not even sure we ran all of them, but we've run at least half that amount, I would say.
So something less than 100 samples.
Yes, something less than 100.
Does that constitute then your personal familiarity with the polymarker kit?
As far as actually running it, yes.
You haven't done any other testing using any other techniques for these 5 genetic markers, have you, other than
No.
the one time with the kit?
No.
As far as presentations, and this would be lectures, have you attended any lectures or presentations reporting information about validating the use of the polymarker in forensics?
I haven't attended any lectures, is it, or meetings, is that what you're saying?
Yes, any presentations?
No.
This particular set of 5 genetic markers, are they all amplified at the same time using this thermal cycler, the machine that actually copies the DNA over and over again?
Yes.
Is there anything unique about that to forensics as far as multiplying more than one marker at the same time?
It's done with genetic applications as well.
So in other words, this amplifying a number of markers at the same time is actually also used in disease diagnosis, correct?
Yes.
And that would be a clinical use?
Yes.
As far as these markers themselves, are they simply 5 more genetic markers that are used to type samples in a forensic case?
Yes.
In other words, there's nothing unique about them in comparison to DQ alpha.
Other than they're a different gene, different genes.
And then in that same vein, I'd like to turn your attention to D1S80. Have you ever tested that particular marker in your laboratory?
No.
Have you bought or used the kit? Well, let me rephrase that. As far as this particular marker, is it also tested in kit form commonly?
Yes.
And is that again another kit marketed by Perkin-Elmer, manufactured by Roche?
It is.
Have you ever bought or used that particular kit?
No.
Is that again simply another marker that's available for use in terms of being another particular genetic marker in addition to DQ alpha and the 5 polymarkers?
Yes.
Is there anything unique about D1S80 that makes it a good or bad marker?
That particular marker is a little different. It doesn't use the dot blot detection methodology. It's a little different detection That's the only major difference.
So in other words, the way that the marker's actually typed is a little bit different than DQ alpha and the poly markers, right?
That's correct.
Is it actually read, and you may have read testimony and descriptions of D1S80 results, is it actually read a little more like the RFLP method?
It is.
And there's nothing wrong with utilizing that particular method of telling different types than instead using, let's say, a dot blotting technique.
Objections, wrong, vague questions.
Sustain or rephrase the question.
As far as typing D1S80 by this method that's more like RFLP typing, is there anything unreliable about that technique?
All of these are, again, the point is that they're all PCR-based tests. They're all susceptible to the dangers of, because of the sensitivity of the test.
Well, just referring you now to the way that it's typed, setting aside your concerns that you've expressed, is there anything different about typing it by the more RFLT type, P-type banding pattern method versus simply dot blotting it?
Well, it's different. There's nothing wrong with it if that's what you're, as far as that type of detection system.
Have you ever, and you have described, let me ask one question first. You've described the fact that in your laboratory you use, was it FDA-approved tests?
The clinical testing, the majority of them are FDA approved, yes.
Okay. Is there anything about FDA approval that means you either can or can't use it in a clinical setting?
The regulation is in terms of being able to market a kit for the purpose of clinical testing. The FDA, a clinical lab can run a test that's not FDA approved. They have to just do their own validation and satisfy CLIA that that's been done.
Do you do any testing in your laboratory using techniques that are not FDA approved?
Yes,
For example, what?
the CMV test for PCR.
And this is a test that you use in casework with samples that come into the lab to determine whether the CMV virus is present at sufficient levels that some medical danger may exist.
That's correct.
Are there any other tests that you use in your laboratory that are not FDA approved?
None that come to mind at the moment.
I don't believe I've asked, as far as the CMV testing itself, what percentage roughly of the casework in your laboratory does it constitute?
You mean in terms of HLA and everything else?
Yes, of casework.
Less than 10%.
Is it your testimony that unless a test is FDA approved, it shouldn't be used?
No, the point behind FDA approval is it's generally considered as the ultimate validation for a clinical-based test. It doesn't mean that testing can't be done just because it isn't FDA approved.
And as far as the forensic tests used in this case, they don't have FDA approval, correct?
The FDA does not approve forensic-based testing.
The absence of that FDA approval does not mean that the tests are unreliable simply because they don't have FDA approval, correct?
That's correct.
Is it correct, Dr. Gerdes, that one general measure of scientific acceptability of a test is the number of labs who are using the technology and cross-checking one another?
That's one way of looking at it.
Is it also correct that another measure of scientific acceptability of a test is the number of publications that have stated in fact that the test is reliable and it can be reproduced?
That would be one aspect.
Are you aware of any publications that demonstrate that if properly used, the DQ alpha typing kit produces proper, accurate, and reliable results on forensic samples?
There are publications in the forensic literature that state that.
Are you aware of any publications that demonstrate to the contrary?
As I mentioned earlier, there are numerous publications that deal with and discuss the contamination issues, the sensitivity issues that we've gone over a number of times here. none of them will have come straight out and said that you shouldn't use the kit.
Are there any publications demonstrating the scientific unacceptability of using the polymarker kit in forensic samples?
No.
Are there any publications demonstrating the fact that use of the D1S80 typing kit produces unreliable and inaccurate results?
Again, there are numerous publications that discuss the problems. None of them come right out and say you shouldn't use the kit.
I'd like to talk with you a moment about peer review. You're familiar with the term peer review?
Yes.
What does peer review mean?
It's a process where if you are going to publish an article, the article is sent to a number of reviewers who are your peers, that is, people who have an equivalent training, and they will evaluate that, criticize it, make suggestions, and before the article can be published, it has to be approved by a majority of those peers.
The peer review process is an important one as far as scientific literature, correct?
It's important in academics.
Is it in fact one of the ways the scientific community validates a technique to determine its accuracy and reliability?
Not necessarily. I mean, you're not validating the technique. You're just basically cross-checking with a number of your peers to see if your statements are defensible scientifically.
Doesn't this publication process allow other scientists to look at the findings of scientists who publish this material to be able to evaluate whether or not a technique in fact should be used?
The publication usually is not strictly being offered for the purpose of a flat statement that a particular thing can be used. I mean, it's generally a scientific documentation of observations.
Incidentally, I'm sorry.
And the peers will look at those observations and see if they have been analyzed in a scientific manner and whether the conclusions are reasonable.
You mentioned the fact that there were publications that talk about contamination involving PCR, correct?
Yes.
Those publications serve as warnings to individuals who perform the typing process so that they can incorporate what that publication is showing into their own wealth of knowledge. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on the publication. That's too general of a statement. There are publications which are just blind trials, if you will, where on PCR, where the kit was sent, and then there was an observation of contamination. It was simply reported that so many labs had contamination.
Are you, in your opinion, familiar with the DQ alpha forensic typing literature?
Yes.
That is extensive, isn't it?
Fairly, yes.
I'm sorry, can I have a moment now? Dr. Gerdes, are you familiar with a book entitled PCR Technology?
Yes.
And are you familiar with who the editor of that book is?
I believe it's Henry Ehrlich.
Who is Henry Ehrlich?
Henry Ehrlich is an individual who was at CEDIS at the time this technology was being developed at that particular company, and has done work in the area of HLA
And HLA
typing.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
HLA typing.
HLA again includes not only DQ alpha, but also at least one of the markers typed in your laboratory.
Yes, that whole gene complex.
Have you read that book?
I've read most of it.
There is a chapter in that book entitled Applications of PCR to the Analysis of Biological Evidence. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Have you read that chapter?
Yes.
Do you recall who the authors of that chapter are?
I believe Henry Ehrlich is one of the authors, if you're referring to the same one. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yes. I don't I would recall the other authors.
Is Cecilia von Berldingen an author to your knowledge?
Yes.
and Russell Higuchi,
Yes.
George Sensabaugh,
Yes.
and Edward Blake.
Yes.
With regard to that article, in your view, is that an article demonstrating the validity of PCR forensic typing using the DQ alpha marker?
I think it discusses the issues. I don't think it justifies the validity based on that article. It's basically a review article.
Okay, does it discuss, in fact, the uses of PCR to type samples using markers including DQ alpha?
It does.
Are you also familiar with an article entitled Polymerase Chain Reaction, PCR, Amplification and Human Leukocyte Antigen, Oligonucleotide Typing on Biological Evidence Samples Casework Experience?
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
And you've read that particular publication?
That's Ed Blake's article, correct?
Yes. Are there other authors as well?
Yes.
And do you rely on that article in terms of any of the opinions that you've offered in this court?
No.
Do you, in fact, reject what's written in that particular publication?
I consider that publication a one-sided slant on the cases. It discusses a number of cases, several of which I've been involved with, where there were highly contested issues which are not discussed in that article.
Dr. Gerdes, with regard to these publications about DQ alpha, and again, there are a large number of them, correct?
Yes.
Do you rely on any of those publications that, in fact, demonstrate this reliability of the DQ alpha typing process?
I'm familiar with those publications. I think it's a misstatement to say I rely upon them.
Well, do you, in fact, reject their findings about reliability?
I accept their observations of problems and discussions of those in certain instances. I disagree with certain other statements. And I disagree with their conclusions in some instances. It's very general. You'd have to take them one at a time to...
Okay. Are you familiar with a publication entitled DNA Typing from Single Hairs?
Yes.
By Russell Higuchi and other authors as well?
Yes.
And have you read that particular publication?
Yes, I have.
In terms of its findings of reliability, do you reject the author's conclusions?
Well, that particular paper is simply a demonstration paper. It's a paper that the overall bottom line is that it shows that it's possible to obtain a DNA result on a single hair. And that part of the paper I don't disagree with. That certainly is possible. It doesn't discuss the difficulties that there would be in taking that technology and using it on a routine basis in crime scenes.
Are you familiar with a publication entitled Genetic Markers in Human Bone 1, Deoxyribonucleic Acid DNA Analysis by Henry Lee and others?
I'm familiar with that.
Have you read that publication?
Yes.
Do the authors of that publication include individuals at Cellmark Diagnostics?
I believe so.
Does the name George Herron sound familiar?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, was that individual, Mr. Herron, Dr. Herron, actually at Cellmark Diagnostics at one time?
I believe so.
Are you familiar with the name Dr. Daniel Garner?
Yes.
Who is he?
He's, I'm not sure what his exact title is. He's from the FBI and is involved in the DNA, the Department of DNA Testing or whatever they call their department.
Actually, Dr. Garner is at Cellmark Diagnostics, is he not?
I'm sorry, I'm thinking of, yes, okay.
With respect to this publication, do you reject Dr. Lee and the other authors' conclusions about the reliability of DQ alpha typing?
Again, I mean, that is a demonstration paper that shows that you can use this technique under controlled conditions to identify individuals based on bone. It doesn't discuss the general problems that can occur, the routine application in labs, and it doesn't discuss the aspects of determining whether a specific laboratory may have significant contamination problems, which would render those demonstrations of capability invalid.
One more, if I might, Dr. Gerdes. Are you familiar with a publication by the Federal Bureau of Investigation entitled Validation Studies on the Analysis of the HLA DQ alpha locus using the polymerase chain reaction by Dr. Comey and Dr. Bruce Bedoli?
I'm familiar with that.
Have you read that particular publication?
I have.
That publication deals with reliability of DQ alpha typing, correct?
It does.
That publication also deals with contamination and its effects on typing using forensic samples.
Yeah, again, it's a demonstration paper. What they dealt with in that paper in terms of contamination is one experiment where 5 tubes were opened on a bench top. They scratched their head over the tubes, closed them up, showed there was no contamination. That's a demonstration. Demonstrates that under those limited number of samples, they did not get contamination. From that, they conclude that contamination is not an issue. That I disagree with.
We have just discussed approximately 5 publications, is that right?
Yes.
There are many more, are there not?
Yes, and most of them are, as I said, demonstration papers that show under controlled conditions in specific instances in particular laboratories, it's possible to obtain a type.
The last article that Mr. Clarke referred to, I believe, has an exhibit number. It came up in the testimony of Mr. Sims, and I don't have it right here, but I think it would clarify the record if we could identify it by that number so that we can flag it with the other testimony.
It's identified by its title and authors.
Dr. Gerdes, you referred to these largely as demonstration papers, is that correct?
That's what I consider them.
Have you ever done such a demonstration paper as far as this particular forensic area of typing is concerned?
No, I haven't published in the forensic area.
Now, I'd like to shift your attention, if I could, to the polymarkers. I believe we discussed those a few moments ago. As far as that particular set of 5 genetic markers, there are similar publications, are there not, in the scientific literature?
There are similar demonstration papers. It's a newer system, so there are fewer in number.
Are you familiar, for example, with a publication entitled Evaluation of the Amplotype PM DNA Test System on Forensic Case Samples?
Who's the author on that?
George Heron, Nicola Fields, and Rebecca Reynolds.
Yes, I'm familiar with that article.
Incidentally, PM, is that short for polymarker?
Yes.
And with respect to that article, have you read it?
Yes.
With respect to this article also, do you reject its findings and conclusions about reliability of the PM typing system?
I believe they did 16 samples there. It's a demonstration paper, and it's interesting that in one of those 16 samples they had a chance match.
Is this another paper that you consider a demonstration paper?
Yes.
In your opinion, is this a paper then that does not demonstrate the accuracy and reliability of using the polymarker typing kit on forensic case samples?
Well, I think the analogy here that might clarify this whole thing is basically if you have a clinical kit that someone is using, there may have been some publication as far as the use of that kit, but the ultimate test of any kit, of any method, is how it's used in the field. It's just like products. Just because you put a product on the market and someone says that's a good product, it doesn't mean it's a good product until you've had a chance to look at a large number of individuals who use that product, and if it starts to have flaws, those become apparent. And it's a similar thing in forensics or anything else.
What about when many laboratories use the technique and they reach the same conclusions as the authors? Does your opinion still hold true under those circumstances?
In my opinion, we haven't reached that stage where there's been enough testimony and discussion and in-depth analysis of the specific problem of contamination and how that can create errors in a blinded fashion in the forensic community.
In your view, courtroom testimony is important in establishing scientific validity?
In my view, that's like the consumer report. It's how is it working in the field? We've done these demonstration papers that say it's possible. Now we've put it out into the field. We put it out put it on the market. How's it working? What's the feedback from the consumer?
I'm sorry, can I have a moment, Your Honor? Incidentally, when you referred, Dr. Gerdes, to the first Polymarket article, the one we just discussed, as being 7 laboratories, were you speaking of a different publication?
Excuse me?
When you referred to this paper by George Heron et al. On evaluation of the PM system, were you
Yes.
mistaking that one paper for another as far as the 7 laboratories?
This, if you can let me look at the paper, I can answer that question.
I would ask now that these be marked so that we can know which ones they are.
Why don't you show it? Why don't you show it?
They've shunned the witness.
Can I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
No, that's the paper I was referring to.
All right.
In terms of the false match, you mean?
I'm sorry?
In terms of the false match?
No, you mentioned 7 laboratories.
No, I didn't.
All right.
I said several.
Oh, several, I'm sorry. All right. Are you also familiar with a publication entitled Consistency and Reproducibility of Amplotype PM Results Between 7 Laboratories Field Trial Results
I'm familiar with that.
by Nicola Fields and Rebecca Reynolds again?
Yes.
Have you read that document?
Yes.
And do you reject its conclusions about reliability of the PM typing system?
Again, it's a demonstration paper.
As you've used the term earlier.
Yes.
And lastly, in this area, are you familiar with Amplotype PM and HLA DQ alpha typing from pap smear, semen smear, and post-coital slides by Dr. Rena Roy, and Dr. Rebecca Reynolds?
Can I see that?
Sure.
I don't believe I've seen this paper.
All right. To your knowledge, other than the publications that I've just described, are there others demonstrating the reliability of PM typing on forensic samples?
There are other demonstration papers that with regard to the use of the polymarker system.
As you've used that term.
Yes.
Can you tell us approximately how many laboratories type the polymarkers in forensic casework?
There are probably hundreds of labs. I don't know an exact figure.
I'm sorry, hundreds?
Yes.
Incidentally, all of the publications that I've shown you are described the title that we've discussed, with the exception of the last one that you're unfamiliar with. They are all from peer-reviewed scientific publications, correct?
That's correct.
And actually, the last particular publication I showed you was also from a peer-reviewed publication. Is
Yes.
that correct? And then lastly, with regard to the D1S80 system, are you familiar with similar publications demonstrating the reliability of that particular marker's use in forensics?
There are similar demonstration papers discussing the capability of that system to produce a type.
Without going through each of them, would your answers then be the same with regard to those publications, that they are in fact demonstration papers only?
Yes.
In your view, they in no manner establish the reliability of D1S80 typing on forensic casework?
They do not. As I mentioned before, my opinion is the product has to be used to an adequate degree and evaluated in a critical manner, in a critical blinded manner, before you can really determine the errors that are possible with this system.
Can you give us an estimate, for instance, how many cases you think DQ alpha typing has been used in forensic casework just in this country?
I'm not aware of how many. I'm sure it's probably in the hundreds.
And I believe you described earlier, over 100 laboratories use the technique. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
so it's probably even in the thousands.
Isn't it more likely in the many thousands?
I'm,
I don't believe I asked you about D1S80. Are you familiar with approximately how many laboratories use it in casework?
again, that's a newer system. It would be fewer than the DQ alpha, but most of the labs who have set up PCR for one system are fairly rapidly add the next one.
As far as all of these markers, DQ alpha, polymarker, and D1S80, is it correct that there have been many presentations about their use in forensic casework? And I'm referring to meetings, lectures, symposia, and so forth.
Yes,
That's a fairly common event. Let me rephrase that if I may. That's a fairly common manner of the scientific community discussing work, whether in forensics or clinical work. That is, presentations and symposia.
yes,
Do those presentations, conferences, and symposia play an important role in not only disseminating but also discussing scientific techniques?
yes,
With regard to polymarker and D1S80 and DQ alpha, have you attended any such meetings?
no,
You've described how the DQ alpha marker was the first marker used following PCR amplification in forensics, correct?
correct.
Are you aware of when that began? When was the first case using PCR DQ alpha?
I know when the kit was released approximately, which was in 1990. And I believe that there was a single individual doing typing probably 3-4 years before that.
Would 1986 be approximately the time of this individual doing that work?
That might be the case. PCR was first published in 1985.
I'm sorry.
So, and this individual happened to be working in the same area where that method was developed.
Who was that individual?
Ed Blake.
Is it correct, or it is correct, isn't it, that when you add more markers, in other words, from DQ alpha adding additional markers like PM and D1S80, that adding of more markers allows the analyst to cross-check results on individual samples?
It allows cross-checking as long as you have totally ruled out the possibility of cross-contamination. Because in the case of cross-contamination, remember, you can look at as many markers as you want to, and the error is caused by that physical cross-transfer, and therefore that type of contamination would not be detected.
Like your clinical use, where more markers provide you more information, isn't it also true that adding more markers in a forensic context increases the probabilities that a sample came from one person to the exclusion of others?
That's true.
You have previously said you would like to see more forensic markers added to DQ alpha, correct?
I think it does add to the capability of detecting the other types of contaminants, which are the contaminants due to amplification product carryover, for instance.
In other words, by adding additional markers, you increase your chances of detecting contamination.
That's true.
And you so testified in 1990 about it would be good if more markers were added to DQ alpha.
That's true.
Since that time, 6 additional markers have been added that are routinely used in forensic casework, correct?
Correct.
Those 6 markers that were added to DQ alpha were all used in this case. Is that right?
That's correct. Since that time, it's become more abundantly obvious to me that the type of cross-contamination
Well, I'm sorry.
is an
Objection
equal
moved to
problem.
strike, Your Honor.
Non-responsive. You're right. Stricken.
As you add more markers, don't you increase the ability to resolve ambiguities or uncertainties about typing results?
you increase the capability of resolving ambiguities due to amplification, carryover, that kind of contamination, yes.
Incidentally, you've described in your laboratory about the use of PCR with some samples and also using other techniques, serologic techniques.
We do both kinds of techniques in our lab, yes.
Well, what I'm really directing my question to is, are there any samples that you use PCR with that you also type using serologic techniques?
Yes.
Why do you use both of those tests on a given sample?
Well, for the specific cases I'm thinking of, they give you different information. So, for instance, if I want to look at a serological marker for cytomegalovirus, that tells me which individual is at higher risk of having this virus become a problem after they've received their transplant. Someone who has antibody to that